Poor girl is ignored in the conversation circle. Even the millionaire asks, "Does anyone here know what dignity is?" What he did next, no one forgot. The silence was piercing. Everyone laughed, toasted, and talked about investments, trips to Europe, and champagnes with names she couldn't even pronounce. Sitting at the head of the table, wearing a simple dress that clearly didn't fit the surroundings, Emily tried to smile, but every glance was like a thorn. One of the socialites whispered loudly, enough for everyone to hear, "She works in the company's warehouse. She's here out of pity." Muffled laughter, sidelong glances. Emily lowered her eyes, trying to hold back tears. No one stood up. No one defended her, until a voice echoed through the room, firm, filled with something stronger than anger, pure contempt. "Does anyone here know what dignity is?" Everyone fell silent. The owner of the voice approached slowly, staring each person down. He was the richest man in the room. But what he did next, no one ever forgot. The room fell silent. The millionaire walked over to Emily, reached out, and with an unexpected gesture, removed his own designer jacket and draped it over her shoulders. "You see clothes. I see courage," he said quietly but firmly. "You know what else she carries that none of you understand? Integrity." Those words were like an earthquake among those present. But the real impact came later. He revealed that Emily wasn't just an employee. She was the owner of the patent that had saved the company months ago, working in silence and being ignored. The following week she was promoted. Many of those who scoffed were fired, and he disappeared for months. But when he returned, he wasn't the same. Neither was she. And their reunion would change more than just their stories. It would change the entire city. Before continuing, I want to invite you to subscribe to the channel and like this video so you can continue receiving our real stories. Thank you very much. The room glittered with golden lights, glasses clinked in empty toasts, and plastic smiles vied for attention like jewels in spotlights. It was Holden Enterprises Gala, an event where top executives flaunted their power and guests competed in appearance, influence, and vanity. Emily felt every inch of the simple skirt she wore weighed down. She was there at the insistence of the HR director, who considered her an example of overcoming obstacles for the company's internal marketing. But in practice, she was an extra in the elite's theater. The room was decorated with amber LED-lit columns, a piano soundtrack in the background, and waiters serving caviar like peanuts. Emily kept her gaze down, sitting at the edge of the conversation circle, her spine straight and her hands restless in her lap. Around her, the other guests talked about vacations in Aspen, new cryptocurrency investments, and cars with artificial intelligence. One of the men in the circle, Darryl, East Coast expansion manager, looked at her and said, "What about you, Emily? Any news from the warehouse? Are the boxes still there?" Laughter. Everyone, even from those who didn't understand. She forced a smile. Her heart raced and embarrassment burned. A second later, another comment came, this time from a heavily made-up young woman clinging to the arm of a veteran investor. "I thought this party was for executives. Did they bring the cleaning staff as a courtesy?" The laughter was now loud enough to woo. Silence even the orchestra in the background. Emily said nothing. She didn't need to. The embarrassment was already screaming at her. That's when his footsteps echoed. Genuine leather shoes, a tailored suit, the look of someone carrying the weight of the world without ever showing it. Benjamin Foster, founder of the company, a man with a fortune estimated at 9 figures and a presence that chilled the room with a single look. He didn't laugh, he didn't drink, he just stood there, staring at each of those who mocked her. "Does anyone here know what dignity is?" he asked. The question dropped like a bombshell. And although no one answered, everyone understood that that night would be remembered for much more than embarrassed laughter. Emily grew up where maps hesitate to enter, on the forgotten outskirts of Flint, Michigan, in a house barely standing, but where her mother's love tried to offset the cold that the broken heater never quite conquered. She was the only child of a woman who cleaned 3 houses a day and still found time to read biblical parables by candlelight. Her father? He disappeared before Emily could walk. From an early age, She understood that the world wouldn't give her anything for free. At 7, she was already helping her mother sort recyclables. At 10, she sold brownies they'd made in front of the school to raise money for her mother's medicine, as she coughed more and more and pretended everything was fine. Public school was more a survival camp than a place of learning. But Emily loved books. She took discarded ones from the library, wet ones from the rain, torn ones from the trash, and read them like someone devouring hope. One day, a teacher noticed her talent for calculus and challenged her with college questions. She solved them all. That same year, her mother fell ill for good. Cancer. Emily, at 16, had to drop out of school to work as a supermarket cashier, care for her mother, and still find time to study alone, hidden in the store's storage room. She slept little. She cried silently, but she never complained. Before her mother passed away, she said a phrase that was tattooed on the girl's soul. If you can't shine like others, then shine with your courage. No one can erase that. When her mother died, Emily didn't even have money for the wake. A neighborhood pastor organized everything. She didn't cry at the funeral. But the next night, he promised at her graveside, "I'll change everything, Mum, even if it takes my whole life." And he carried that promise as a beacon. She earned a scholarship to a community college, studying at night and working during the day as a cleaning assistant at a local company. It was there that he began to show his talents in logistics. And so, years later, friendless, unsupportive, and uninhibited, she walked through the back door of Holden Enterprises, wearing a blue uniform, a warehouse assistant badge, and her head held high. No one knew who she was, but she remembered every face that ignored her. And she never forgot her mother's voice, "Shine in your courage." The bet came like so many others in that bubble of vanity and arrogance, spontaneous, cruel, and purposeless, just to fill the boredom of those who have everything, except character. It was the end of a rainy afternoon when invitations to Holden Enterprises' annual event were distributed. Among the emails to the company's top names, a strange name appeared at the bottom of the list: Emily Carter. Warehouse manager. No one understood. Some laughed. Others thought it was a mistake. But it was Darryl who saw a perverse opportunity there. He proposed to the 10th floor group a corporate game. Let's see how far an invisible person can go before realizing she doesn't belong in this world. The bet was simple. Make Emily attend the event, sit with the executives, be ignored, embarrassed, and eventually leave in shame. Whoever made her cry would win an expensive dinner at the most expensive restaurant in town. They laughed. They thought the idea was brilliant. They even created a messaging group called Chameleon Project, with memes and inside jokes, mocking her outfit, her table manners, the wrong words she would say. It was more than a joke. It was a social ambush. And to ensure she accepted the invitation, Darryl himself posed as an HR representative and sought her out in the stockroom. He gave a moving speech about merit, saying the company wanted to value her, that she would be the employee of the year. Emily didn't believe it at first, but her eyes sparkled. After so long being ignored, this seemed like a legitimate chance to be seen, and she desperately needed it, not out of vanity, but for a breather, for validation, for peace. In the days leading up to the event, she used what little she had to buy a dress on sale, sewn by a local woman. She did her own hair, watching tutorial videos. She painted her nails with expired polish, and she rehearsed formal phrases to avoid making any blunders, all with her heart beating between hope and insecurity. The big day had arrived, and as expected, she did. She arrived early. She sat at the head of the table, as if she didn't want to disturb anyone. She greeted everyone politely, but every smile she offered was met with indifference. The guests looked at each other, communicating with silent codes. The group Chameleon Project vibrated with her every gesture. When she tried to make conversation and was ignored, when she picked up the wrong cutlery, when she confused the name of the wine, she didn't know it, but she was the target of a bet, an experiment in mockery. They were making fun of her dignity, and the more she tried to fit in, the tighter the trap closed. The climax would come when one of the group members would say a rehearsed phrase to trigger an emotional breakdown. But no one anticipated that. Behind that shy smile, there was a strength they would never understand. Benjamin Foster didn't usually attend internal company events. He preferred private meetings, quiet decisions, contracts signed behind mahogany doors, and absolute silence. He was a man who avoided the spotlight, but his absence, paradoxically, always filled the space. That night, however, something changed his mind. Maybe it was the boredom of routine. Maybe it was the fact that his name was on the line as the event's patron. Or maybe it was just curiosity. The story of a warehouse worker being awarded Employee of the Year seemed, to say the least, intriguing. When he entered the room, everyone felt it. Benjamin didn't need to raise his voice, he simply appeared. His presence imposed silence like a prayer. His steady gaze, his restrained walk, the tailored suit tailored to the millimeter, and the slight nod as he passed among the guests made him an almost mythological figure. Emily saw him from afar. She froze. She knew his face from magazines. He was the face behind the empire. The man rumored to have fired people, with a glance, and bought companies before breakfast. And now he was there, close, real. For a moment, she forgot her insecurity. Her heart raced, but not out of fear, out of reverence. Benjamin saw her too. His eyes scanned the room like someone searching for flaws in a project. He noticed the usual groups, the same calculated smiles, the rehearsed conversations. But something was off. That young woman sitting discreetly at the end of the head table. There was something about her that bothered him. Not the dress, too simple, nor her posture, stiff and out of place, but her gaze. It was a gaze that asked for nothing. Not approval, not pity. It was a gaze that simply observed, as if expecting something bad, but determined not to fall apart. That captivated him, and he walked over. The circle of executives around him looked at him strangely. Some tried to distract him, others feigned enthusiasm, but Benjamin walked straight ahead. He stopped a few steps away from Emily, saying nothing. She felt her breath catch. He stared at her for long seconds and, instead of asking a question, simply pulled out a chair next to her and sat. The silence was piercing. Everyone stared, confused. Emily didn't know what to do. Darryl himself, who was leading the bet, was speechless. Benjamin picked up a glass, raised it slowly and said, "To the silent merit, to what no one sees but sustains everything." And he toasted alone. Emily, with teary eyes, returned the gesture with a slight raise of her glass. It was the first contact. No direct words, no questions, just a gesture. But in that world where everything was appearance and ego, it was an earthquake. For the first time, someone truly saw her. Not as a distraction, not as a joke, but as a human being. The tension in the room became almost physical after Benjamin's solitary toast. The elite present didn't know how to react. Accustomed to controlling the game, they were surprised by the silent movement of someone who, until then, seemed oblivious to the petty social dynamics they controlled. Darryl, feeling his prominence threatened, recovered from the shock with a forced smile. He approached the table with his wineglass and pulled out a chair opposite. "So we're really toasting invisible excellence," he said sarcastically, drawing laughter from his companions. Benjamin, impassive, kept his gaze on his glass. Emily, however, felt her throat close. This wasn't just mockery, it was a direct attack. She couldn't respond. Darryl continued, "By the way, Emily, we didn't know Holden Enterprises was investing in inclusion aesthetics." The laughter was louder this time. One of the directors choked on his sparkling wine. One of the women whispered, "She doesn't even know what foie gras is." Someone imitated her voice, saying, "Can you wrap this caviar to go?" The group frolicked like hyenas around prey. Emily tried to stand, but her hand trembled. Her face no longer concealed the pain. Benjamin watched her silently, as if analyzing the impact of an injustice in real time. The circle of executives continued relentlessly. Darryl turned directly to her and said with a false smile, "You know what dress code means, don't you? Or did you confuse it with a department store discount?" The entire room burst into venomous laughter. It was at that moment that the pianist missed a note, the only off-script sound of the evening. Emily closed her eyes. Each word was a blade. She tried to take a deep breath, but the tears won. They flowed without permission, silent, hard, screaming. Then she stood, her entire body trembling, and said simply, "Thank you for the invitation." Her voice was shaky, but it carried a strange dignity, as if she had been expecting it all. She turned to leave, her eyes glazed over. No one stopped her. No one moved, except one figure. Benjamin Foster stood slowly, tall and solemn, as if every muscle obeyed a moral code forgotten by everyone there. Everyone stopped. Even the laughter stopped. It was then that he asked loudly, so there would be no doubt, "Does anyone here know what dignity is?" The sentence cut through the room. Darrell tried to respond with a nervous laugh, but Benjamin was already walking toward Emily. He took off his jacket, tailored in London, and draped it over her shoulders. "You see clothes, I see courage." And without looking at anyone else, he led her back to the table, ignoring the stunned stares in the room. The silence that followed was the loudest the room had ever heard. Emily remained seated beside Benjamin, his jacket still draped over her shoulders, a silent shield against all that cruelty disguised as etiquette. The room, which had once teemed with laughter and arrogance, was now a prison of lowered eyes and held breaths. But she no longer trembled. She didn't cry. She was strangely calm, like someone who had finally seen the true face of a world she had tried so long to reach. She looked around. Every face that had laughed at her avoided eye contact. Every voice that had mocked her now hid behind glasses, cell phones, or feigned neutrality. And it was in that moment that Emily understood she no longer needed to prove anything, that humiliation had, in fact, been the greatest mirror of all. And then, while everyone pretended nothing had happened, she looked at Benjamin with devastating serenity and said, "I knew it." He raised his eyebrows slightly, as if he hadn't expected to hear anything. Emily continued, "The bet, the group, the fake invitation, the social joke, I knew everything." The silence split in two. The few closest to her widened their eyes. She kept her voice low, firm, emotionless, as if she were simply delivering a report. "I found the group message on the HR printer. The jokes, the screenshots, the names, I knew they would laugh, that they would feign empathy just to see me break down, and yet I came." Benjamin said nothing. He just listened, attentive, without interrupting. Emily smiled sadly. "Not because I believed you, but because for a moment I wanted to prove to myself that I could handle it, that no dirty look, no snicker, no comment disguised as a joke would make me go back to who I once was." Her eyes shone, not with tears, but with truth. "I came knowing you'd try to crush me, but what you didn't know is that I've already survived what killed me inside once, and no one in this room has the power to do it again." A collective, suppressed sigh spread through the room. The betting group stood still like children caught red-handed. Benjamin then broke the silence. "You truly stood above them all. Even knowing about theatre, you took the stage with dignity." Emily didn't answer. She simply slowly removed her jacket from her shoulders and held it out to him with a brief smile. "Thank you. But today, I no longer need protection. I need distance." And she stood up, this time without a tremor, walking between the aisles with the erect posture of someone who carries a clean name, even if no one there knows how to say it out loud. She knew she had won, without shouting, without taking revenge, simply by being bigger. After that night, Benjamin Foster couldn't sleep. For the first time in years, his mind, trained for cold calculations, billion-dollar investments, and market-affecting decisions, was occupied by a single thing: the image of a simple woman leaving the salon with a dignity no one there could ever match. Emily Carter. Until then, for him she was just a name in the footnotes of operational reports, a tiny piece on the grand chessboard of Holden Enterprises. But now, that name wouldn't leave his mind. The next morning, Benjamin arrived at the company early. He ordered the complete dossier on her. HR hesitated. Then they complied. What he discovered left him speechless for minutes. Emily wasn't just a dedicated employee. She had been responsible for reorganizing the company's entire supply chain the previous year, creating a management model that reduced costs by 22% and increased delivery efficiency by over 30%. The report was signed by his direct superior, Darrell, who had appropriated her ideas and presented them as his own. Benjamin demanded access to internal emails. He read exchanges between Darrell and other managers, speaking of Emily with contempt, mocking her intelligence, and at one point quoting, "If she knew the value of what she created, she'd ask for the CEO's job." But she never asked, never demanded. Recognition. She kept working, silently, loyally, and that was precisely what bothered him most. She knew her ideas had been used, she knew they were laughing at her, and yet she didn't stoop to the game. As Benjamin read, other documents began to arrive. A legal opinion requesting a logistics patent signed by E. Carter, a patent registered in his own name, outside the company, a system he himself recognized as the basis for the new artificial intelligence they were developing for route automation. Emily wasn't just talented. She was in fact leading Holden's own innovation department, and no one had noticed. Or worse, they had ignored it, on purpose. And now, Benjamin realized that this young woman, publicly ridiculed for wearing a simple dress, was the most strategic mind the company had seen in years. Later that day, he tried to reach her. He called HR, who informed him, "Emily Carter resigned this morning. She didn't give any notice. She just said it no longer made sense to be out of sight." Benjamin hung up the phone slowly. He felt something he hadn't recognized in a long time. Regret. That kind of silent pain you can't scream, that you swallow hard. He reread the documents, spent hours staring at the sentence in her resignation letter. Silence is sometimes the loudest answer anyone can give. So, for the first time in a long time, Benjamin didn't go to her Manhattan penthouse that night. He went to the suburbs, to her registered address. The house was empty. Neighbors said she'd left early with a suitcase and a look that said she was finally going where she belonged. No one knew where she was going. And there, standing in front of a rusty gate, Benjamin Foster, the man who had never been ignored by anyone, felt for the first time the taste of emptiness that couldn't be bought. And he knew. He had lost something that no amount of money could ever restore. Emily disappeared without a trace. She turned off her phone, deleted her social media, and moved without warning. It was as if she'd decided to erase the version of herself that had once tried to be accepted by a world that had always kept her on the outside. Benjamin, on the other hand, felt her absence like a nagging echo that spread through every corner of his life. In the early days, he tried to follow his routine. Meetings, reports, contracts, mergers. Everything worked, as it always had. But nothing seemed to have any flavor, not the private chef's coffee, not the French wine that had been resting in the cellar for 20 years, not the dinners with investors on luxurious rooftops. Something had snapped inside him, and Emily's absence was slowly becoming a presence. He found himself staring at the table where she had sat at the party. He replayed the security camera footage from that night, silently watching, over and over, the moment she left the room with his jacket draped over her shoulders. It was as if reliving that moment was a way of understanding something he'd never been able to name. Holden Enterprises continued, but Benjamin began to withdraw. He resigned as board member, declined invitations to events, and stopped appearing in the press. His personal secretary noticed subtle changes. He began listening to instrumental music he'd never liked, read books Emily had mentioned in the corporate library's internal records, and once she swore she'd heard. He'd said her name during a phone call without realizing it. Meanwhile, Emily was starting over. She rented a small house in a rural Pennsylvania town. She accepted a simple job as a volunteer consultant at an NGO that supported single mothers. She helped broken women, just like her mother had once been. There she rediscovered something that had no name, but which she felt in every gesture: usefulness, truth, voice. At one of these community gatherings, a child approached her and offered her a drawing. It was her, wearing a red cape, smiling. Below, the child wrote, "You are a hero no one saw coming." Emily kept that paper as if it were a soul contract. For the first time in her life, she was where she wanted to be. But that didn't mean she didn't feel it. At night, when the lights went out and the city slept, she remembered Benjamin, his silence, his sincere gaze, the way he defended her without anyone asking. It wasn't longing. It was something harder to explain. An unconsummated connection, a bond that never became a knot, but insisted on being there. At the same time, Benjamin wrote letters he never sent, unfinished sentences, choked confessions, apologies without a recipient. He hired a tracking company to locate her, but in the end, he never used the report he received. He kept it in a locked drawer, as if respecting her choice to disappear. But every time he walked through the corridors of the company, where his name was now just a shadow, Benjamin Foster carried with him the question that haunted him. How could someone who barely said 50 words to me say, "Everything I needed to hear"? Holden Enterprises began to crumble where no one expected, from within. It wasn't the numbers, they were still high, nor the shares, which remained stable, but the image, the reputation, the silent prestige that had surrounded it like a wall for decades began to crack. It all started with an anonymous leak of internal messages. Group Screenshots Chameleon Project came to light through an independent corporate journalism portal. The jokes, the humiliations, the names. Every sentence mocking Emily was plastered across the headlines like scars from the toxic culture hidden beneath expensive suits. Social media exploded. The case went viral with headlines like "Multinational Company Rewards Employee and Sets a Trap to Humiliate Her in Public." Feminist groups, social activists, and influencers denounced the perversity of the gesture. People who had never heard of Emily began treating her as a symbol. The hashtag #SheKnowsEverything, it became global news. What's more, it was discovered that the revolutionary patent underlying Holden's new distribution system had been created by her, and not acknowledged. An avalanche of criticism descended on the company's board of directors. Investors began pressing for answers. Darryl was hastily fired, but it was too late. He was photographed trying to leave the country days later. The scandal grew. Employees began reporting abusive behavior, exclusionary practices, and internal manipulation. What had been a stone's throw became an avalanche. Benjamin, even without direct involvement in the bet, became the target of questions. Why had he allowed it? Why hadn't he acted sooner? Where was his integrity? His omission was interpreted as complicity. He was called for interviews, but he refused them all. He appeared in front of the cameras only once and said simply, "A leader's worst mistake isn't making a mistake, it's pretending not to see it." And he left in silence. The statement, though honest, wasn't enough. The company's board met. For the first time in 20 years, they proposed that he step down as honorary president. The decision was unanimous. Benjamin Foster was removed. The tabloids reported, "The silent empire falls." His assets weren't threatened, but something far more valuable was his credibility. Benjamin, until then a symbol of authority and command, was now remembered as the man who allowed virtue to be humiliated, and only reacted when it was too late. Internally, he accepted his downfall with strange calm, as if he understood it wasn't punishment but consequence, and instead of defending himself, he retreated. He sold properties, he terminated contracts, he began to live discreetly. The man who once made the world bow now walked alone through streets where no one recognized him. And yet something inside him began to find peace, as if by being exposed, he had been freed from the armor of power he had worn for decades. Because deep down, he knew this fall wasn't the end. It was the beginning. Benjamin Foster, now far from the spotlight and the pedestal the world had placed him on for decades, faced the mirror of his own humanity for the first time. The days following his public downfall were marked by brutal silence. No longer the sound of desks adjusting agendas, nor meetings in glass-enclosed rooms overlooking the Manhattan skyline. Now, all he could hear was the ticking of the clock hanging on the wall of his old house, the creak of wooden floorboards under his own footsteps, and the echo of a conscience he had never truly listened to. It was in this powerless environment that his transformation began, not by imposition, but by exhaustion. He began to frequent places where his name was worthless: community libraries, simple coffee shops, park benches. With each anonymous face he encountered, he felt less like Benjamin Foster tycoon and more like a man trying to rebuild himself, and curiously, he began to enjoy it. He read philosophy books, rediscovered classical music, watched old films about redemption, and cried, yes, cried alone, more than once. He felt ashamed for not having been better, for not having acted when he should have, for having remained silent at the very moment when someone like Emily most needed a voice. One cloudy afternoon, walking through the old part of the city, he saw a woman trip and drop her groceries. No one helped. He ran. He knelt. He picked up bag after bag, scooped up the apples that rolled onto the sidewalk, and returned them one by one. She smiled, said thank you, and walked on. But Benjamin stood still, staring at the empty street, feeling that this small gesture was worth more than any billion-dollar merger he had ever signed. In the following months, he began to quietly get involved in social initiatives. He made anonymous donations. He invested in education projects in marginalized neighborhoods. She created a foundation, without her name, that funded scholarships for vulnerable women. But none of this was publicized, not out of humility, but out of shame, because he knew some of those women could have been like Emily. In a moment of courage, he sought out the community school where she had worked briefly, but learned she had left weeks earlier. The coordinator, unaware of who he was, said something that resonated with him. She helped the children as if she carried within herself all the pain she wanted to prevent in them. Benjamin listened with tears in his eyes. And then he understood. It wasn't about regaining power or forgiveness. It was about becoming, finally, someone who deserved to be remembered, not for what he built, but for what he perceived. Because in every life he touched, in every pain he alleviated, he silently tried to repay the invisible debt he owed to a woman who asked for nothing, just respect. The reunion didn't happen under the spotlight, nor in front of cameras, much less inside a luxurious penthouse or corporate office. It happened where life pulsates with simplicity. At a small rural community fair, set up in a square surrounded by ancient trees and children running among stalls selling sweets, used books, and crafts. Emily was there as a volunteer, helping the local NGO sell products made by mothers in the community. She wore a white shirt folded over her arms, simple jeans, and her hair tied in an unpretentious bun. She smiled lightly, like someone who had made peace with her own history. She was talking to a woman about recyclable notebooks when, suddenly, her eyes met his, from a distance between two stalls. Time froze for a second. Benjamin was standing there, holding a bag of cheese bread and an old book with a faded cover. His grey hair was looser, his beard slightly unshaven, and his gaze, the same gaze from that night in the salon, but now without the weight of pride. He said nothing. He simply walked toward her with measured steps, as if unsure of his welcome. Emily, also silent, held out a bag to a customer and excused herself, slowly walking toward him. When they stood face to face, there was more silence than words, more truth than rehearsal. Benjamin lowered his eyes, clutched the book in his hands, and took a deep breath before saying, "I didn't come to apologize. I came to acknowledge that I lost something precious before I understood its value." Emily held her gaze steady. There was no hurt, no irony, just a calmness that cut like a knife. He continued, "I read everything. About what you created, about what you endured, and about what you didn't say." He took the book from her hands and handed it to her. It was an old edition of The Power of Simplicity by an author she had once quoted in an internal presentation, and which no one heard except him. Emily held the book. She smiled, but she said nothing. "I spent months trying to understand why you left such an impression on me," Benjamin said, his voice trembling slightly. "And today, I think it's because you were the only person who didn't try to please me. You just existed firmly, and I I never knew what to do with someone like that. The silence between them was broken by a child running between their legs. They both laughed quietly, and for a moment it seemed like the whole world had disappeared around them. Emily broke the silence. I didn't leave out of anger. I left because I was tired of asking for space where they only gave me crumbs. He nodded. And are you happy here? She looked around, saw the simple people smiling, the clear sky above the trees, and replied, Here I exist. No one applauds me, but no one erases me either. Benjamin lowered his eyes, bit his lip, and murmured, And is there room for those who have finally learned to see? She didn't answer. She just looked him in the eye for a long moment and smiled, tenderly, but also with the strength of someone who knows exactly who she is. It was in that moment that he understood. Perhaps their reunion wasn't a chance to start over, but to finish what he never knew how to begin. Benjamin stood still, unsure of what to expect. For the first time in his entire history of silent victories and flawless negotiations, he felt his presence guaranteed nothing. There was no control, no power, no advantage there. There was only her, Emily, standing before him, an old book in her hands, eyes piercing his defenses. He tried to find deeper words, something that could express what had been growing inside him since the night. He saw her humiliated, and yet walk away with her head held high, but she was quicker. She said calmly, What exactly did you come here expecting? He hesitated. I don't know. Maybe hope. Emily smiled lightly, without mockery. Just a gesture of someone who understands more than she lets on. I didn't hold a grudge against you, Benjamin. I only walked away because I no longer wanted to beg for space, and because I understood that when a woman learns to walk alone, no one else has the right to hold her hand as if it were a favor. Benjamin nodded, his eyes moist. I learned that too late. She took a deep breath, looking at the stalls, the clear sky, the ordinary people milling around, oblivious to that moment, laden with memories. You asked me a question there at the fair if there was room. He stared at her expectantly, almost broken inside. Emily then replied, There is room, yes, but not here. He swallowed hard, not out of wounded pride, but in recognition. You don't need me anymore, I know. She shook her head. It's not that. I need you away so you can keep changing, so you can keep feeling, and maybe, just maybe, one day, in another time, in another place, we can meet again, and be what we couldn't be before. Benjamin smiled with sadness and admiration. Do you forgive? Emily looked deep into his eyes and replied, Forgiving is easy, forgetting is hard, and forgetting, I don't want to. He lowered his eyes, defeated, and healed at the same time. The defeat wasn't against her, it was against the man he once was, and leaving wasn't abandonment, it was a gesture of respect. He extended his hand. Emily hesitated, then shook it, a firm, calm touch. Farewell and gratitude in a single gesture. As he turned to leave, she called out to him, Benjamin. He turned, his eyes red. Thank you for seeing me, even if it was late. He smiled with his eyes and left, walking slowly among children, books, and fairground sweets, like a man who, for the first time, walked without haste, and she stood there motionless, feeling the wind touch her face, without pain, without regret, only with the certainty that for the first time in her life she had made a choice of her own. It was late afternoon, when golden light touched the trees as if time had stopped for just a few minutes. Emily sat on the wooden bench next to the empty playground in the square where she usually watched the children play after community school. Beside her lay the same old book. Benjamin had given her weeks before. The worn cover, the yellowed pages underlined with blue ink, trembled slightly in the breeze. She opened it to a random page, but didn't read. She just looked, as if the act of flipping through it were more important than the words. The sky was clear, silent. A group of children ran past, laughing, and one of them, a girl of about 8 with her hair in crooked braids, approached Emily and asked, Are you a teacher? Emily smiled, more or less. The girl then handed her a small folded piece of paper. It's for you. She ran after the others. Emily opened the note. A drawing made with colored pencils, a woman holding a book, surrounded by stars, and a sentence written in childish handwriting, "Thank you for listening with your heart." Emily held the paper gently, then tucked it inside her book as a bookmark. She stood up slowly, walked to the end of the square, and looked toward the main street. Far in the background, amidst the coming and going of cars and ordinary people, a man walked alone, light suit, slow steps. It was Benjamin, but he didn't see her. And she didn't call out to him. She just watched him for a few seconds, like someone watching the final scene of a film that needs no explanation. Then she smiled, not a smile of longing, nor of pain, but of someone who understood that some stories don't end happily. They end with dignity, and moving forward, in silence, can be the greatest symbol of self-love anyone can offer. Emily turned and walked the other way, letting the wind carry the rest. The sun finally set, and no one needed to know what happened next. If you've made it this far, it's because this story touched you in some way. So tell me in the comments, would you have forgiven or gone silent like she did? I really want to hear your opinion. And if this story touched you, don't forget to leave a like. It shows YouTube that this content deserves to reach more people. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories of poetic justice and transformation. And now, while you're here, take advantage of it. Click on the video that is appearing on the screen. He'll give you goosebumps with an even more powerful twist. See you there.